The Cold War FPS 83 is officially back in development. This is a game based on the same premise as Rising Storm 2, semi-realistic combined arms warfare with large-scale teams. After a lot of ambiguity as to what was happening to the game, Blue Dot Games has picked up where Antimatter Games, the previous developer team, left off. The CEO of Blue Dot Games and lead designer of 83 sat down and did a little Q&A regarding the future of 83. Now, both of them have been working together for 15 years and were part of the development teams for things like the Rising Storm DLC for Red Orchestra 2, as well as the Rising Storm 2 Vietnam standalone game. 83 is set in an alternate timeline in, as the title kind of implies, a Cold War gone hot scenario in the early 80s. Basing this off screenshots and trailers, it'll initially feature British, American, and Soviet factions, though obviously more factions are very likely, I assume, down the line, either as free or paid add-ons. Of course, East and West German units, Polish, French, Czechoslovak, you can keep going until you've named every single Cold War belligerent in Europe. The lead designer says that he specifically picked a late Cold War setting as they felt they'd done a lot of World War II in the past, but that a very modern setting wouldn't allow for the asymmetrical combat that they want to showcase as they've done in previous games. So they landed on this era with famous and well-known vehicles and weapons, but without all the bells and whistles of high-end technology such as drones and UAVs and more. 83 intends to deliver a Milsim-esque or accessible realism experience, meaning that the game will be, quote, as realistic as possible up until it stops being fun and then it's winded back a notch, end quote. It'll likely be very similar to Red Orchestra 2 and Rising Storm 2, where Hell Let Loose and Squad have down states and medics to help you get out of those. I would assume that 83 skips those and you're either alive or you're dead, much like, again, RO2 or Rising Storm 2. This means that fights are fast and they move on quickly, meaning you don't have to wait for a medic that either has to revive you or teammates, so action is fast and keeps on moving. While the developers wanted to feel somewhat realistic, players should be able to pick up the game without having to deal with a huge learning curve that might scare away potential interested people. A few matches at best should allow someone new to the game to pick up on the game mechanics according to the developer. Both Rising Storm and Rising Storm 2 Vietnam were kind of centered around asymmetrical combat, with factions having different advantages and disadvantages during battles, but still feeling balanced in the greater scheme of things. Whether this will be a feature of 83 kind of isn't really detailed, but based on what they said about why they picked this era, it is very likely we'll see some of that asymmetrical gameplay come back in 83. The game will combine the ability to fly helicopters like we saw in Rising Storm 2 Vietnam with the ability to drive tanks and vehicles like we saw in Red Orchestra 2. We can actually see a few of them in screenshots and trailers, though the A-10 is likely like a commander call-in type of deal as opposed to a player-controlled vehicle. The trailer showcases tanks such as the American M60, what I believe is the Soviet T-64, as well as a bunch of British and American wheeled vehicles. Assuming the British will also have a tank of their own, this might become something like the Chieftain. I also think that we'll see at least some APCs or IFVs, such as a BTR or BMP series, as well as Bradleys, M113s, and Warriors for the Soviets, Americans, and British, respectively. Initially, the idea behind the game, early on in development, was to have a persistent type world, sort of like Helldivers 2, with actions of players on different servers impacting a basic persistent global war. Losing or winning battles, or even capturing areas on the map would lead to the global power shifting, giving a certain faction bonuses in the game. The switch of development teams and probably readjusting their scale, the feature has been shelved, but the general idea of all of this taking place in mainland Europe has remained. They do talk a little bit how they had ideas for, say, a Eastern Bloc invasion of Miami or a NATO invasion of Cuba, but these have also been shelved for now. And I understand why it would take a lot of extra work and development time, but it would have been such a unique and cool thing to see in a FPS game. Right now, it is set in Germany, as that would be the most likely battleground for the Cold War gone hot, though other locations have been teased a bit here and there. The devs say that there likely will be more areas to fight in, however, it it takes a lot of work to create locations from scratch, especially in Europe, as building styles, infrastructure, and foliage can be quite different between even neighboring countries. Developer specifically mentions Arma, Squad, and Hell Let Loose when describing the dreaded long 4 to 5 minute walk to the battlefield after a respawn, just to get shot and then having to do that all over again. Rounds in these games can sometimes last hours, coming down to a large time investment to see it through all the way to the end. For 83, the developers are specifically looking to make rounds last around 30 minutes, with respawning or re-entering combat after a respawn taking about 30 seconds. Obviously, with vehicles, especially helicopters, this does come with some challenges as to create a fair battleground for the infantry as well as the vehicle crews. Maps in 83 will have a lot of room for vehicles to maneuver and flank, something that I always felt was kind of missing from Red Orchestra 2 and its pretty linear tank combat. Commanders and squad leaders will again play a big role as they did in Red Orchestra 2 and Rising Storm, as well as of course Rising Storm 2. Though they don't say much about it here, commander abilities such as calling in artillery, recon, or for example that A-10 gun run are definitely to be expected. Perhaps we'll see some asymmetrical ones too, like we did in Rising Storm 2. I want to touch shortly on why 83 ended up in development limbo, with Antimatter Games dissolving, and not a revival of the game by Blue Dot Games, as the Q&A answers this in quite some detail. So 83 was only worked on by a single person, the lead designer, in this Q&A for almost a year, with the rest of the team that had been assigned to 83 initially actually being put to work on IGI, a different game which I plan to make a video on for the future. 83 was never cancelled officially, but it was definitely put on ice when its development was completely paused, when even the lead designer was pulled off the game and asked to take over on IGI. A big publisher almost took over the 83 IP, but they ended up being more interested in IGI. However, neither game was actually eventually picked up in the end. The CEO then explains that he found out that Antimatter Games was going to shut down soon and figured a lot of the staff would soon be out of a job or looking for one. Grabbing some of these developers and staff, they made Blue Dot Games, who are now working on 83 again. Finally, hundreds of testers will soon be getting their hands on an Unreal Engine 5 version of the game, if I understand it all correctly. While the developers are busy looking for publishers and investors to help push 83 to get from where it is now to an actual delivered product. People who are interested in getting 83 to that final step can go to their store page, which is also linked below in the description, and wish list the game, which apparently helps developers showcase public interest in their game and will make it easier to find potential publishers and investors. It's no secret that 83 has had a very rough couple of years, switching developers, being basically all but canned and put on ice, and going from being forgotten to now being revived. With two of the high-level developers in this Q&A being well-versed in Red Orchestra and Rising Storm, I think 83 should prove to be a promising upcoming shooter. Hopefully they can find investors and a publisher to help bring the game to a release state. What do you think about 83? Are you excited to see this officially back and better than ever? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next one.